In this chapter, we learn about the lymphatic system and how it's going to assist the circulatory system in returning fluids that were otherwise left behind during the exchange in the capillary beds. And we're going to see how those fluids get screened for the presence of pathogens and how the body then can respond if pathogens are detected. So we give three basic and important functions to this system. We give the recovery of fluid. Again, this would be the excess fluid that doesn't return to the capillaries when exchange occurs. We give the transport of fats, so this would be for absorption of fats in the small intestine. And it comes down to that fats are so large when they are absorbed that they cannot move into a blood capillary. And then lastly, and most important, and what we spend most of our time on, is the defense that these do, because this is the one and only thing that the lymphatic system is going to really do that other systems don't help so much. We have other forms of protection, but really outright, active defense, that's the lymphatic system. Now, and when we start a chapter, we always want to think about the things that we already know as we're trying to then learn new stuff. So I said this is a system for fluid recovery, so these lymph tubes are going to run in parallel, right next to all your cardiovascular tubes. And we're eventually going to dump the fluid back into the blood vessels that you see. They've just shown you a little piece of it right here. So when we look at that movement of the fluid, we have to compare and contrast to what we know about the cardiovascular system. So it turns out the lymph system is different in the sense that it is not a circuit. So we don't begin in one place and come back to that place. It really begins as capillaries, right? And it's going to end with ducts. And there's only two ducts, and they're a right lymphatic duct on this side and a thoracic duct on this side. Okay? We are going to pass through a number of just generic vessels to get this fluid back, and we're eventually going to also have trunks. Now, something different as well as starting as lymphatic capillaries is the fact that this fluid that we're going to call lymph fluid is going to eventually move through very small but well-structured organs called lymph nodes, and hundreds of these will be in line in these vessels. And I say here that this is one of the ways that we're going to be able to defend and optimize our defense, is that in the lymph nodes are going to be cells, and this just shows you a picture of a lymph node here, which will interact with pathogens. Again, pathology is disease generating, so pathogens, bacteria, viruses, fungi, parasites, etc. We will filter through and interact with these and start a defense, and we're going to recover the fluid that was lost as well. So fluid will be moving through these and moving on back to the heart. But in here, we would get our chance for encounter and defense. And I do make that comment several times in my lecture, and I want to just state it right here as we begin this video, is that the job in defense is, first of all, identify, right? So recognition, containment, right? Killing, and cleaning up. And those are really four very important steps in sequence that we have to do every time a pathogen enters the body, a potential pathogen. Because again, that recognition, binding and collecting them is going to be part of that, is it a pathogen or is it not? Oops. All right, so again, looking at the fluid recovery, because in the beginning we want to deal with the easier things. We say that, in that fluid recovery part where we start as capillaries, as we see in this little cartoon, and we're recovering the fluid, which would be this represented by the blue here. So stuff left the capillary, it went out into the blue area, which is the interstitial area, and forms this stuff we call interstitial fluids or tissue fluids. And then some of the stuff here moves into the cells. Now, of course, some of the things in the cells move out into this fluid, but the idea is that if we, delivered through the process of filtration, delivered on the arterial end of the capillary bed, a liter of fluid, we want to recover. We want to bring back a liter of fluid, because like I said, if you don't balance that, pretty soon after so many trips through the body, we're going to have exhausted those 5 to 6 liters of blood. And I mentioned, just to be realistic, you have 5 to 6 liters of blood, in which probably, only about 2/3 of that, or roughly not quite 2/3, about a little more than half of that is going to be the actual fluid. So it wouldn't be very long before we wouldn't have any more fluid, and of course you die, because without fluid you don't have pressure, right? And without pressure you can't deliver. So I say here again, you don't have to know these numbers, but recall that overall 20 liters of fluid leaves the capillaries on a daily amount, right? So moving out, because again, you only have 5 to 6 liters, but remember they're circulating and recirculating, recirculating, recirculating. So overall, 20 liters of fluid leaves the capillaries with this process of filtration in the arterial end. And we said in the chapter on cardiovascular that this was due to the fact that hydrostatic pressure, or blood pressure, was high on the arterial end. Now, only 17 liters of this are reabsorbed, and this is on the venular end, and we said, again, reinforcing that this is due to osmotic pressure, right, which is, again, the pressure of these large proteins and molecules that stay in the blood, right, never left this blood. So that difference is 3 liters, and that's quite a bit in the scheme of things. That would probably be about your plasma volume. So how do I get this back, all right? That's what we're going to talk about here in this chapter. I say also this allows a return of leukocytes, because remember, those white cells are your defenders and they are not going to stay in the blood vessels. Remember, diapedesis allows them to squeeze out during inflammation and go out here. Well, we do want them back because they are patrolling, and so the ability of the lymph system to collect these cells is really good. And again, then set up a defense, right, a whole network of defense that is outside of circulation. That's what lymph gives us the ability to do. All right, so this is a cartoon I borrowed from the chapter on cardiovascular that shows, again, the skeletal muscle and a blood vessel. And here's our reality, right? This is pushing through this constant contraction, shown here, and relaxation. We push the fluid, lymph fluid, back to the heart. And this is done showing it for the venous return, but the same thing works for lymph. So this is a compare, not a contrast. There isn't a pump, right? No heart that is the center of this lymph system. It's not a circuit, so return depends on action of skeletal muscles, shown in this cartoon. Respiratory movements, right? So inhaling and exhaling, and the change in pressures that occur, right? With inhaling, when you increase pressure in that abdominal and decrease it in the thoracic. And then valves that really catch the fluid if it starts to flow back, right? Smooth muscle is also in the larger lymph vessels. So when we look at the materials in the wall, we see that the lymph vessels themselves are very similar to veins. Their tunics are a bit thinner even yet, but they are very similar to veins. And that includes smooth muscle that surrounds the tube and can contract and help to push. All right, so here in the beginning with the lymph capillaries, a nice cartoon again to show this idea. We're inside, here's our boundary of our lymph capillary up close. This would be the actual lymph fluid. Here's the cells of your body. And this is just showing that this material is really kind of held in place and allows us to keep our lymph vessels open, because of course the more fluid that leaves a capillary, the more forms here, the greater pressure that might push these closed. But lymph vessels don't close, all right? I said here, if the interstitial pressure is low, they close. If it's high, they stay open. Of course, they close when it's low because they're not needed. If it's high, so it's high when you've left a lot of fluid behind, like what occurs when you see edema, they stay open and they keep on working. So even though people with edema clearly have a problem, these lymph capillaries are really working to the best of their ability to keep trying to return fluid. All right? And so I say here again, this interstitial fluid that we mentioned previously, that is the fluid that leaves the capillary and is exchanging with the cells. That interstitial fluid, which accumulates in these spaces, enters the lymph capillaries, and once it's inside, we call it lymph, as this kind of shows you appropriately. In the lymph capillaries in the small intestine are actually known as lacteals, and they are found in the middle of the villi, which are structures that make contact with your food. And these are specialized to absorb fats. And one of the reasons they do, as I said before, is that fats are very large molecules. And if you look at the cell-to-cell connections in capillaries, they're too tight or continuous to allow big molecules in. But here in a lymph capillary, there's spaces, as you see here. And these spaces allow not only that fluid and large cells to come into a lymph capillary, it also allows us to absorb fats. Right? We do find these again throughout the body. Anywhere you find, blood capillaries, you're going to find lymph capillaries. So these capillaries, like the blood vessels, right, end up becoming larger because we do our reabsorption here. Now we need to get bigger and bigger to contain all the volume that's coming back and get it through to the heart through one tube, right, which are known as the ducts. So I say, as I mentioned before, the walls are very similar but thinner. Right, lymphatic vessels are composed of 3 layers. So again, you have your inner tunica, that's endothelium, smooth muscle that can contract, and connective tissue. Contains valves, just like the veins did. And the larger vessels lead to lymph nodes, and the lymph nodes are going to filter. And then they're going to leave the lymph node. The fluid moves on through the lymph node, and these vessels then form larger tubes called trunks. Right. This is just a cartoon to show you, especially the ducts, which are on either side of the body. Turns out that the right lymphatic duct drains the right side of the head, the right arm, and the right part of the thoracic cavity. The left side, which is called the thoracic duct, because it really begins as a large tube in the thoracic cavity and moves up, it drains most everything else. Right? So these trunks will keep on getting larger and larger till we finally have just 2 ducts on either side of the body. The trunks themselves are named for where you find them, as are the nodes when you look at this in lab, right? So lumbar region in here, intestinal. So there's lots of activity here in the thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavity. So, right, the ducts, I say here again, the thoracic is draining most of the body. It originates as this structure called the cisterna chyli or chyli, and this is, of course, right in the middle part of the body as the small intestines, draining from the small intestines. So it's one enlargement cistern, right? Refers to that enlargement. Passes in front of the vertebra and keeps moving up. And once the cisternae enters the thoracic cavity, we call it the thoracic duct. So it drains quite a bit of the body. Right lymphatic starts as originates as the right jugular and right subclavian. We've got the right bronchiomediastinal trunks that also come together. I don't see myself asking you, a question to say, what trunks drain into the 2 ducts, but that's for your information. Now, as we look at the organization of immune function, which I think we'll stop here and we'll do this in the next video, I want you to think, we've got these 3 groups of things. So some parts of our body are going to be strictly barriers. We're then going to have cells that help us with our defense. And immunity means, again, you're not going to get sick. When we say immune function, it's preventing sickness, immunity from sickness. And then there's a whole series of soluble proteins that protect you.